go ahead and do that. And we are going to be recording this conversation. I know a lot of folks couldn't join us today. So we'll be able to send out the recording afterwards, and we'll have it on our YouTube and on all of our different platforms as well. So we're really looking forward to that. We do ask that you stay muted for the conversation portion that Deepa and I will be having, but then afterwards we will open it up for Q&A, and we're hopeful that you all will either come off of mute and off of video if you'd like and ask your question directly, or feel free to put it in the chat and we'll read it off for you, or you can send it to me directly and I'll read it anonymously if it's a more personal question that you want us to answer. Looks like we have some great folks in the room. Nate, thank you so much for arranging this. So Nate actually introduced us to Deepa, and we're so grateful for the introduction because this conversation is really important and it really is in line with what we're doing here at Baumhart. So in that case, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen just to give a little context for the conversation that we're having today. So once again, thanks for joining us for Women of Color, Redefining Power in Corporate America as part of a program that we're putting on through the Baumhart Center for Social Enterprise and Responsibility. My name is Ella Mccann. I am Manager, External Relations and Strategic Partnerships for the Baumhart Center. I've been here for a little under a year now, and I'm joined by my lovely colleague, Erin Lippert, who is also here at the Baumhart Center. And as many of you all may have seen, next week, we will have our new director, Karen Weigert, starting. So we're really excited about the future of Baumhart and glad that you all are joining us on this journey as well. So the Baumhart Center is housed in the Quinlan School of Business at Loyola University, Chicago, and we are preparing leaders to tackle society's most pressing challenges through education, engagement, and research. And we do this by living at the intersections of profit and purpose, and we are creating future leaders through our Baumhart Scholars MBA program. You can learn more about that on our website. We have a number of our scholars on this call as well, and you're welcome to reach out to us, and we're happy to put you in touch with them. It's a really #7 nonprofit MBA in the country, amazing program that's thinking about social impact, all those different aspects, DEI, CSR, ESG. What does it mean to have purpose in your work? And I think a lot of us are thinking about these things as we are, I don't know, going through this great, I'm not sure what it's called this week, great realignment, great reassessment, great rethink, whatever you call it. We're all thinking about these types of things. And this MBA really gives you an opportunity to think about how you want to incorporate purpose into your work, and definitely over the sort of capitalistic profit aspect of work that we have maybe decided that is not working for us. So that's a little bit about Baumhart. And we're so grateful today to have Deepa Purushothaman joining us for this conversation because it's really timely and important. And it's asking us to think about these structures that we've built and that we've constructed, right? And how they can really harm women of color. And I think there's some facts that we probably, some of us on this call may know, but maybe some of us don't, which is that women of color are on track to become the largest demographic in the workforce. And that's really significant because, women, years ago, women couldn't even be in the workforce, and now we're about to be at the largest point of that. And I think a lot of people, think of C-suite and you think of the man in charge of the company and things like that. And that's just really changing, and we need to be prepared for those conversations. And we also have the Women in Workplace report from McKinsey, which shows that even though we're going to become the largest demographic, women of color only account for 4% of C-suite leadership. That's not going to match up, right? That's not going to work for the future of business. And I think the thing that Deepa touches on in her book, which we'll talk about a little bit in the conversation today, is that this structure of corporate America that we have was not built for us. And I do want to pause and acknowledge that the conversation that we'll be having today will be heavily America focused and America centric. And it will also be with two women, cisgendered women who are identifying as, women of color in the workforce. But I do think that the structure was not built for these communities that are going to become the largest demographics. And so that's something that we want to acknowledge, but also talk about in our conversation today. And so, as I mentioned, we are thrilled to have Deepa joining us today to talk about her new book, which is out next week on March 1st, The First, the Few, and the Only. And so with that, I'd love to stop sharing my screen and go ahead and go into conversation with Deepa about your new book. So welcome, Deepa.
Thank you for having me. There's so many things you touched on the introduction that I want to go deep on already, but I love that you're saying you don't know if it's a great resignation or the great, reawakening or what we're calling it this week. I almost feel like it's the great redo for people like me who, I had a career and I'm getting to redo it in the ways that really matter. And so I love that. And I think the facts that you shared are so important, and we're in such an important moment, and you're all the leaders that can help define what comes next and don't have to accept the structure as is. And that's so much of what I agree we want to talk about today. And although some of the things that we touch on might be around the corporate space, I think what I have found in my continued conversations after the book is that so much of what we're going to talk about applies in all sectors. And so, yes, my research is heavily corporate based because that's where I come from, but we need to talk about changing things everywhere. So excited to be here and have this conversation.
And I know we have folks in all different sectors all around. So I actually really want to quickly do a poll. If folks could let us know, there's 4 questions in it. So how are you entering this space? Are you feeling energized? Are you feeling open? Are you feeling kind of meh? Are you feeling tired? How you might identify coming in. So a woman of color, an ally, maybe you're uncertain about how you would identify with this conversation. Where you are in your career, early exploration, student, early career entrant, middle management, and then C-suite, and what sector are you aligned to? And as we mentioned, our MBA program features scholars from the government sector, public sector, private sector, all those different things. So we'd love to just really quick, if folks wouldn't mind doing the poll, just so again, we can get a feel for who's in the room. And I know the chat is still active and we love that. We have a wonderful group of folks. So we also encourage you all to get to know each other in the chat. If there's anybody that you want to connect with, this is a really great opportunity to do that as well. And yeah, we're just so grateful to have such a wide range of folks in the room. Okay, open. Oh, this is interesting. It's definitely shifting as we're even thinking. Okay, so a lot of middle management. That seems to be the largest percentage right now. Private company, social, only a little government. This is good to know. Good to know. I'm glad that most people are feeling open. I'm sorry that folks aren't feeling energized and are feeling maybe tired. I know it's a rough time right now, but we're hopeful that by the end of the conversation you'll feel energized and empowered to go out and really make some changes for yourselves and for others as well. So yeah, that's just to give us some context, Deepa. So we've got a lot of middle management, women of color and allies. People are feeling pretty open, and we've got a lot of private sector. Next up, social sector, nonprofit advocacy, a little bit of government, and then a little bit of other.
Got it.
Thank you all for filling that out. And we'll go ahead and just so everybody can see that. Again, see the breakdown we've gotten here. So a really great group of folks. And so with that, I sort of want to start with one of the aspects that you talk about in your book, and it's actually in the title, right? Which is that you were the first woman of color to become a senior partner at Deloitte. And I wonder how that shaped your experience in the workplace. Because I think a lot of times we're often the first or the only or one of few women of color in these spaces, right? So talk to us a little bit about how that sort of shaped your experience in the workforce.
Absolutely. And part of why I picked that title is because the more I talked with women, like that really explained our experiences in these structures, right? Whether it was in school or whether it was at work, the idea that we were the first, right? The first in our family to maybe go to college or to have a professional career, one of the only in a department or a large program, or the only in a C-suite position, and one of the few, right? Traditionally in a company. My own experience was I made partner relatively young and pretty quickly, and I was the first Indian female partner that we made. And that was, I'm going to date myself here, but that was about 14 years ago. So it's not like it was decades and decades ago. And so although exciting, like it's not that long ago. And part of the challenge that I found is, although I was very supported and really pushed forward, and that also happened. So there's a positive and a challenge, I think, that happens when you're a first. So I had a lot of support. The challenge was I didn't see examples of models that looked like me. And so I think I struggled for quite a bit early in my career to find my voice, to figure out what leadership looked like, simple things from what to wear to how to act to how to give feedback, like the more challenging things that we don't really talk about. Like as a woman of color, you can't tell someone that, they're not meeting par in the same way that I think a white cisgender man can. It's just very different. People don't like us to tell them they're not doing a good job. And so there were things I just had to learn and navigate on my own. And I ended up looking at a lot of models around me and then kind of trying to pick and choose because I didn't see one that looked exactly like me. And so that's what I learned over time, that I had to reprogram, and there's a line in the book that you don't have to see it to be it, but that was a very active programming. And I also think it's important to talk about the fact that many of us get that from media, get that from other places growing up as well. So you come into this institution already not really being seen and heard, just growing up in America, and especially being Indian, like there was conversation around being Black and there was conversations around being white. Like my conversation didn't happen for most of my life. And so I just always felt invisible. And then to kind of enter a space and not really see me, it makes you question if you belong. So there was a lot of belonging question in my history that I think was only maybe pushed on more as I navigated corporate structures.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've always noticed, a lot of times we'll talk about Asian, but it's usually East Asian, right? And South Asian tends to get, sort of eliminated there, right? So we're constantly fighting for representation for all folks and things like that. And I totally understand that. I grew up in spaces where I was, again, one of 5 Black kids at the school, right? One of the only Black families at the resort, like all those different things, right? And it's just when you grow up like that, it definitely shifts how you think you're supposed to present yourself in these spaces, right? And I think that sort of segues into the next question, which is, you write that the structure of corporate America was not built for us or by us. And I wonder what that means for women of color who are trying to navigate their careers, right? Because we're entering into these spaces that don't even allow us to fit in, right? Like, I've experienced moments where I used to have my hair pulled all the way back because that was the more like proper way to look, right? But then I let it out. Oh my gosh, like you have like long hair and all those different things. Or like, I used to think that I had to straighten my hair in order to be accepted, right? So I wonder if you can talk about how these structures that weren't built for us, but we have to fit into, how that helps women of color navigate their careers.
I'll come back to the structures, but I just have to say, so you can see the cover of my book on the wall there. There's a long story behind why it's so big, and the only place it would fit was the wall. But you'll see on the cover of the book, the woman has curly hair. And I share that because it's like a really interesting story. So when you're an author, the cover is just as important as what you're writing. And it was such a process to find representation of women of color. And it was a very, very complicated process on what does even a representation of women of color look like. And I just bring up the hair because she has curly hair in the picture. I have curly hair. And she has curly hair in the picture. And there was a lot of discussion over, should she have straight hair? Should she have like straightish hair with a couple of curls versus curly hair? Because what do people think about? And so I think it's fascinating that it happens in spaces. It happens right around Black women and hair, but it also happens on like the cover of a book that is talking about this topic. So it's really fascinating. What I mean by the structures weren't made by us and for us. And by the way, I don't think they're made for a lot of people. So the book is about women of color, but so much of what I'm talking about applies to everybody in this moment where we're all re-questioning. The model was based on a two-parent, two-family income, a one single family income with 2 parents, where there was usually a stay-at-home life. And that was the model that was constructed decades ago. It has never been updated. So it doesn't work for working mothers. It doesn't work for a situation where there's 2 parents and both working. It never really represented or took into account that there were going to be women of color who had different experiences and different lived experiences and different life experiences. And so the idea of what we think of as leaders and what we think of as leadership is very narrowly defined. That's really what the book is talking about. I open with a story that talks about a conversation I had with Renee Meyers. She's the VP of Inclusion at Netflix, and she's a good friend. And she's like the queen of one-liners. And so we were talking, and I was like, give me a thought around how you see corporate America. And we went to airplane design, and she was saying, I think of airplanes. And I was, thinking that's an interesting conversation. Why do you think of airplanes? And she said, as a mom, so I should set her up. So she's a Black woman. She's much taller than I am. I'm 5'1". She's 5'6", 5'7". She said, as a mom, she worries about getting on a plane and putting the luggage above the head. When she had small children, she would always worry, like, why is the luggage sitting above our heads? And why did anyone do it that way? Because what if we have turbulence and it falls on the children? And so as a mom, she was really focused on that and worried about that. And as we were talking, I told her I'm 5'1". And so my bigger anxiety on getting on a plane is even literally hoisting my carry-on above my head. And I shared with her, like, that's a real anxiety that I usually carry like 10 minutes before I get on a plane. And I used to fly all the time. So multiple times a week, I'd worry about this. And it doesn't even cross people's minds if they're 5'10" or taller, like just putting it up overhead doesn't even really come into mind. And so we had this whole conversation about how airplanes were probably designed for tall white men who weren't traveling with their children on a regular basis. And so it's an example of how, if you don't even consider who is in mind when you design a space, who's at the table designing. And the data showed, as I did my own research on airplane design, that only 2 or 3% of designers were actually women at that time when airplanes were originally thought through.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that we have to scrap all the airplanes, but I'm saying let's be conscious of the fact that it is not set up for shorter people like me. It's not set up with some of the other challenges that moms and others may worry about. And it's the same for the workplace. Like, I think it's a good analogy to take for the workplace, because that's upon first entering an airplane, and the same sort of not belonging happens to many of us when we enter workspaces. If we look up and literally the entire C-suite is white men, like many of us then think, like, is there a path for us, even if that's not the intention? So it was a great conversation and great story around if we're not part of the design, if we're not part of the intention, without realizing it, there can be a message that we don't belong, that we don't see ourselves. And maybe there's other spaces that are more accommodating to us. And that's what I think we carry as we navigate these spaces.
Well, and I wonder, in the chat, if anybody, how many times have you been in a building and you've been so cold and you're just like,
yes.
Why am I so cold? But it's one of those things that I learned early on about corporate buildings, is that they're usually built for men's temperature.
Yeah.
Right. And so even the design of the building down to the temperature of it is not designed for us. And so how are you going to physically see yourself in these spaces, emotionally, mentally envision yourself in these spaces, if you're not even, seen or acknowledged or anything like that when you walk into the building? And I love that analogy that she made about the plane, because I actually hadn't thought about it. I've known about the building one, but I hadn't known about the plane. So that was a really, really great point. And I think
I love that it's coming up now, because I think we're in a moment where we need to rethink work for everybody. The last few years has showed us, right, that work isn't working. I really believe part of what we're really questioning is the space that work takes in our lives. If work has become a situation where we work to live, right? We don't necessarily, it's kind of taken over our lives in so many ways, especially in the corporate system. And so it bleeds into weekends, it bleeds into after hours. And so really rethinking work itself. And if we are ever going to do it, this is the moment that we have to do it.
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning that we do at Baumhart, right? We think about purpose in work and things like that. And so we offer a lot of programming around purpose, and we have a lot of our network that's dealing with these types of things and stuff like that. So again, for folks who are thinking about what role does work play in my life, how do I rise up into these roles, if this is something that you want to do, not only is Deepa's book a really great resource, but also Baumhart has a lot of resources for that as well. So we are, constantly trying to change the narrative that's going on here. So speaking of the Scholars Program, we have a mix of students and people in a lot of mid-level careers and people in tenants. And I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the new rules of power, right? I think our scholars are taught to challenge the norms and the policies that are in place when they're in their courses, and they even maybe, challenge their professors on, like, okay, well, this statistic thing doesn't work with how things are actually going, right? So they're asked to challenge these rules of power, because I think a lot of it is a power dynamic. And so I'm wondering if you can elaborate on how you see some of these new rules and how students and people in mid-level can manage and navigate these power structures that are, again, not built for us, make it really hard for us, right? You don't have the ability to just go out with your buddy and go get a drink and he'll be like, yeah, I'll promote you. Like, that'll be fine, right? Like, that's not happening for us. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so much of the book is like practical, tactical, almost I would say a business case or a manual for how the experience is really different for women of color, like things like how much extra work we get asked to do, how we represent, sometimes our entire race in situations without companies understanding that and the weight that takes on. So that is a lot of what the book is about. But the undertow to the book is that I think we're in a moment where we need to be re-questioning power, right? And so many of us in those structures are taught that power is getting to the top, and that power is a very controlled sort of top down, very, what's the right word? It's very assertive. Yeah, it's a pyramid. It's very, it's not something that I actually aspired to when I sat in that seat. Like, it felt like not necessarily an authentic way that I wanted to lead as a woman of color. And what the book starts to unpack is, are there other ways to think about power? Are there other ways to think about leading? And some of the stories that I uncovered, and again, what's different about the book is I spoke with 500 women of color. And it was also really important that I told this book in women's stories. Like, our stories aren't often talked about. There's hardly any business books that are written by women of color and written to us. And that's also part of what we need to change. And one of the rules of power is this idea that power is about telling people what to do. And I interviewed Stacey Brown-Philpott, and she is the former CEO of TaskRabbit, and she sits on many boards, and she's a Black woman. And we were chatting, and her family had just bought a dog, like a puppy, 2 weeks ago. And so we're talking about power, and she says, I've been thinking about my puppy a lot. Like, I am very quiet amongst my family, but I am very controlled in how I lead. Like, I keep my stuff together. I don't get super emotional. I don't get rattled. I'm just really even keel. And she said, the puppy is gravitating to me. And I think it's partly because I'm providing the puppy this feeling of safety, that I am calm, that I am in charge. If something goes astray, I will know how to lead. And that is, to me, like such an important part of what leadership and power is about. Power isn't about telling people what to do and making them follow you. Maybe power should be really rethought, where we make people and make all employees feel comfortable, that there is a level of psychological safety. And so we had this as an example, one of the big conversations, that power maybe is really thought about in the wrong way. And that power right now is used to control resources and kind of dictate how we do things. And maybe the conversation should really be about changing power, so power is used for good, and that more people have access to power. And how do we rethink it? Because a lot of women of color, when I would say, what do you think of power? There would be an adverse reaction of like, that's not something I want to lean into. Like, power is a bad thing. Power is used to abuse people. And part of what we need to really re-envision is power can be used for good, but we've been told this message of how it should be, especially in corporate spaces, especially in structures and systems. And what I want our work to be as a collective is we have to really change our value system around a lot of these things so that they work for this generation, so they work for all of us. And I don't think that we're in how the structures and systems have been set up really serve many of us. And that's really the underlying conversation. And so there's 4 ideas of how we change power, but this is like the beginning of a movement where I want us to really rethink as a collective, how do we want power to really work for all of us? And how do we start to take it back? That's part of what this conversation is about.
And I think one of the things that I appreciate about the book is that you do this through stories, right? And we talked about this a little bit when we met, a couple of weeks ago, but I think we are all constantly trying to tell our own stories, and sharing them helps empower other people, right? So me sharing that I had issues with my hair when it came into the corporate workplace, maybe there are other people on the call, or other people I've heard it from other people, because for this current role that I'm in, I actually did new headshots with my hair curly, and I posted about it. And then I saw some other folks posted on LinkedIn about it. And like, that was something that was, helpful for others. So I think that's really what I love about this book, is that it's not only a business book, but it's also sharing the stories of women that are relatable. And we'll have a special aspect of this towards the end that I'll share with folks that I'm really excited about. But I think that's—
if I can just add, I think, one of the things that I don't know that I realized as I was writing it is, I think the book is permission, to be honest with you. It's permission to tell our stories. It's permission to be who we are. In so many of these spaces, we're told to edit ourselves and to mute ourselves and to change. I mean, whether it's our hair or how we speak, what we eat, like talk about, the things that we do out on weekends and after hours. It's really about finding our full voice, because so many of us feel alone. That was kind of one of the other things that I found as I met with all these really powerful women of color. So I met some of the most senior women in corporate America, and quietly they would tell me that it's lonely. It's very hard to navigate. And there's a lot of pressure to behave like the white men that have come before us once you take the seat. And so this is really permission to do power differently, permission to show up as yourself, permission to ask different questions. And one of the biggest stories I love is permission to not accept what's come before, permission to really question and to change systems, right? We don't have to accept how they've been. I think there is a moment now, if ever, where we can question everything around us. I'm not saying we'll be able to change it, but let's ask why, and let's ask if it works, and let's rally together, have those conversations.
We're going to be the disruptor generation, which that's scary to some folks, but I think we have to disrupt these structures, right? And it's funny because I grew up with a mother who got into the C-suite. She was eventually the CEO of an advertising agency here. And so I've watched her navigate it as well. So not only did I grow up with seeing these types of things, but now I'm starting to experience it myself. And the power aspect is definitely scary, because I can walk into a room, or I can just speak, and people automatically place like that power thing on there, right? They place it on women of color almost as a way to knock us off of our pedestal, right? Almost as a way of like, oh, you're too powerful. We can't have that, right? And not just related to women of color, but I think all women are also experiencing that aspect of like, rise up and like go and do that and but then they get knocked down, right? But in particular, I think women of color suffer, at least as a Black woman, I've suffered from—
It's worse for Black women for sure. Yep.
tone policing, right? Or like that I, said something and that made somebody feel a certain way. But if a white man had said it, it wouldn't be, that wouldn't be the conversation, right? And so I appreciate that you've talked about power, and it sort of leads into my next question, which is about microaggressions. And one of the things that we do with our scholars is we go through an orientation for them. We have a workshop, and they introduce this topic that some of you may have heard of in your work, subtle acts of exclusion. So instead of microaggressions, we're calling them subtle acts of exclusion. Oh, you changed your hair. Oh, like you're eating that, or like anything like that. Any of those little comments that are reminding you that you are not a part of this group are subtle acts of exclusion that, and a lot of our scholars are in the chat, they definitely remember that from their orientation. But it's different than microaggression, because I think microaggressions, it's become a little bit too, people don't understand the significance of a microaggression. And so when you add in the word exclusion, you're like, oh, I'm actively removing this person from our space, right? And so I wonder if you have any examples of the best way for folks to respond in these moments of exclusion, right? These subtle moments, because if we respond too strongly, then we get attacked, right? But if we don't respond at all, then we get walked over, right? So I wonder if you can talk about that, an example, and maybe an example that you experienced.
Yeah, no, so many things you've just unpacked. So one is, I agree, the terms I use are visible and invisible. So I think women of color are highly visible, and at the same time, really struggle, right, with that visibility and what comes with it, and at times feeling invisible. So there's really that double-edged sword that comes with being one of the first, the few, the only, which I completely agree with. On the microaggressions, it's interesting. Like, I feel like there's a whole set of conversations around stereotypes, which is some of what you're suggesting. There's a set of, behaviors around microaggressions. And then, to be candid, a lot of the behavior is racism. And I think we need to understand it's a spectrum, and all three things affect people and women of color. So part of what was so surprising to me is on the stereotype side or the exclusion side, those small comments, right, that people may not feel like are really a big deal, but those stereotypes are things we've internalized. So many of these women of color I met do things to edit themselves before they even have those issues show up, right? So you'll change your hair before you even get to the workplace, not because anyone has told you, but that's what's been shown to you, told to you. And so I just want to be super clear, like, some of it is being done to us very overtly, and some of us, like, it's just there, and it comes from all these different places. And part of what we have to watch for is we're editing ourselves, because those stereotypes have become things that we have taken in unconsciously. And so that's so important to talk about. But what I want women to do, and by the way, I want allies and co-conspirators to do this too, and I'll define that term in a second, is there is going to be microaggressions. There are going to be exclusionary activities. Is going to be, I'm telling you now, for women of color, you're going to end up in racist situations in the workplace. There's no way to get around it. I'm not saying it'll happen every day, but it will happen. And so what I want us to do is practice. And this sounds really simple, but what I have found is when someone says something so inappropriate, I'm sometimes so shocked that I don't know what to do. And so just having three things that you practice and you say them to, just even for an hour, one day will help you in the long run. But just saying, like, that really didn't sit well with me, or I actually find that really uncomfortable that you just said that, or that really hurt me, that's not appropriate. Like, finding whatever language works for you. But I think most of us are just caught flat-footed in these situations. And for allies and co-conspirators, I would say the same thing. I think a lot of people don't, as allies, practice what they should say. So Ella, if someone says something inappropriate to you around a Black woman, like, it's my responsibility too, if I'm bothered, to say something. But having something ready, like, so that I can intervene in a moment that is uncomfortable, is part of what we're not always taught to do, but it's such a practical, simple thing to do. And so, yes, there are some examples. I have one in the book where, and this was a big one for me. I was at a new client, I was a new partner, and I stepped into his office, and he had a reputation. This was a CTO of a big telco company, had a reputation of not getting along with consultants and being really brash. And so I'd been warned for weeks, like, he's probably going to curse, he's probably going to yell, like, you're really not going to like this gentleman. And I walked into his office 2 steps in, and he looks up with his glasses and he looks at me and he says, "If I had a daughter, she would totally be older than you. What could you possibly have to say to me?" And I was a partner, right? In a big firm, I was there to help him. And I remember sweating in the moment, not really knowing what to say. And I remember gulping, and I don't know where this came from, because so I think it's also important that women of color find strength in these moments. And I took a deep breath and I said, we have an hour scheduled. Give me 20 minutes. And if in 20 minutes, I don't tell you something that you have not been told before, I will give you the rest of the time back and I will never ask for time again. And that's an example of maybe not a racist activity, but it was very uncomfortable, right? I don't know that he even really meant anything by it other than he was just dismissing me for my age. He ended up becoming one of my biggest clients because I did share things with him that no one else had said. And I think part of what I have found for myself, and I think it's true for a lot of women of colors, we end up becoming truth tellers, right? And so truth telling became like a real leadership quality for me and how I've led. But comments like that are really hard to navigate. And so I wish I'd practiced, something of when someone says something like that to you, take a minute, take a beat, take a breath, and collect yourself. Like, you don't have to respond to that. That is totally about them. But we don't talk enough sometimes about the fact that in corporate settings or in work settings, when things are done like that, it can be hard.
Yeah. I'm just like, as you're talking, all these things are flashing in my mind, and I'm like laughing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that situation. And I'm sure that all of us are all reliving these things. And I realized actually a while ago that I had suppressed a lot of these instances, and they're starting to come up. And someone in the chat, let's see, Sadaf, they mentioned that there's really good trainings. Yes, Hollaback has really great trainings. Asian American trainings are happening in Chicago as well. Like, there's so many trainings, but the trainings have also given me the tools to like constantly be looking around, like, I'm going to call you out if you do that, right? Like, there are certain things that they teach you how to do in a safe way, right?
Yeah.
And there are different, if you're not comfortable with calling people out on their behavior, you can also, there are different ways you can do things. But that is one of the things that started to happen for me, is that now I'm even more like, if you say something to Deepa, I'm going to say something. Right? Like, absolutely. I'm more ready to stand up for our communities in a way that maybe in the past, as a woman, I've been taught to like not say anything, just laugh it off, make the other person comfortable. And naturally, I'm just such a people pleaser and like want to, if I'm with a client, I want to make them feel comfortable. But if they're saying things that are really inappropriate, like, it's hard to start laughing about that now, right? Or if he had said something ageist like that when I walked in, I would just been like, yeah, I bet, like, that's so cool, right? We all do that so naturally.
Or we feel the shame in that moment, right? Like somehow, like, that's our fault. It's not my fault that I was young in his mind, right? I can't change that, but what I can change is what comes out of my mouth. And I see Tanya's comment. Yes. Tanya, about it being exhausting. I agree. It's the challenge of when you do speak up in those moments, right? You can be labeled difficult, but I also think, and again, I spoke to a lot of women of color. Ella, what you're saying is absolutely true. I think we've been trained for the most part. Certain Black women were not. Certain Black women were taught about race early and taught like to not accept it. But for the most part, all the other groups of women I met, especially immigrant women, we're told to just put up with it. We're taught to smile. We're taught to move on. We're taught to not make waves. And as a result, I think most of us carry that into the workplace. And so we don't push back. We don't ask questions. We don't say something when it's so inappropriate. But I also think we have to if we're going to make change. And what I hope for this generation, the next generation, is I know that there is some backlash to it, but I also think we can't not say it anymore. It's not working, and it's going to continue to be like one of the most challenging conversations I had was with a biracial CFO. Mm-hmm. And she said to me, the workplace is the same. And she was really sad, like almost on the border of depressed as we were talking. She said, the workplace is actually the same on race and for women in the same now as when I entered 35 years ago. And she was really just reflecting on her career and wondering if it was worthwhile. And so I don't want us to all be in that situation. So I know it's hard. I know it's difficult to do it, but I also think there are ways. One of the people that I really love in this space is Dolly Chung, and she talks about heat and light. And she talks about that you can approach a situation with heat and push back on the racist incident or something that's not appropriate. And maybe you'll get your idea across, but there's also ways to use light to convince people and to kind of do it in a way that's palatable. And so much of what I'm talking about is pushing back, but I agree, maybe not, hitting them upside the head with a 2x4. I'm okay with that sometimes too, because we have to, but maybe not starting with that. And so again, I think it's a little bit of practicing ways that don't put people off, but also don't make you take in, because by the way, you're going to feel hurt when you take that comment in, even if you don't stand up. So what I have found myself is I need to stand up or I'm going to feel crappy later. And so It's hard. That's part of the conversation about being a woman of color at work. There's not a great answer to it, but I think the more of us that do it, the more change we can make. And if we can use each other to share those stories, maybe it'll be easier.
I hope that we all realize that, yes, we are so much stronger together when we all stand up for it, right? And don't be afraid, allies. And you mentioned co-conspirators, and I don't know if you wanted to break that down, but if all of us work together to change things, then it's going to work, because the sum is more powerful, right? We were talking about that earlier, but the sum is more powerful than the parts. But yeah, I wonder if you could break down co-conspirators.
Yeah, so it's a term that I had seen used by Alicia Garza and others. And so it's not my term, but I love it because what she's talking about is this idea that, and she doesn't say it this way, but I do, that we need people to move from bystanders to actually making change. And so it's not just upon women of color or people of color to make change, that we need to work together as a collective. And so instead of allies, I feel like allies is a very unenergetic, not action-oriented term. Like you can be an ally and just say you're an ally and not do anything. And we don't need more of that. We need more people to be co-conspirators and kind of really get involved and get dirty in making change. Otherwise, I don't want any more pats on the back. I want more than that. I want different. Yeah. So that's why I think being a co-conspirator is so important.
Love that. I love that term. I've also heard like comrades, and like just thinking about it, sort of like this group people coming together, right? To do that. So I have a million questions I could ask you. Thank you to Nate as well, who helped with some of the questions. I could ask you so many things. I'm going to ask one more, but then we're going to move into Q&A with folks. And so again,
and I'm trying to read the comments too.
Right? I know, I'm trying to keep up too. I saw one about hair getting changed, and like they make comments like, "Oh, your hair looks so nice," but like that triggers me to feel like, oh, that means I don't look at the other way, or like that's not professional or anything like that, right? Like those comments can even cause people to reflect on that behavior and those ways that they've made themselves invisible and things like that. So again, feel free to put your questions in the chat directly, ask them to me directly, and I can read them on your behalf anonymously, or feel free to raise your hand and we will ask you to come up and ask it sort of on stage with us. Thank you, Charlotte. So the last question that I want to ask is about imposter syndrome, because we hear this all the time. And it's funny because I've talked to two so Joy McWhorter and my mother both hate this term. And because they're just like, you're not an imposter, and you don't have a syndrome, you're not sick. Like, what do you mean by imposter syndrome? And so I wonder if you can talk though about this idea of imposter syndrome that we commonly know it as, and what are some steps that women can do to move past these feelings, because I get it all the time, right? Yeah. And again, it's that exhausting thought process that's sort of been ingrained in us, to think that we're not good enough, that we're not capable enough, and all those different things. So I wonder if you could share some ways that folks can move past those feelings.
Yes. So I think the first thing is there's so much research out there, my own included, but that suggests women, and especially women of color, do have a greater, and you're right, I hate the term, but have this challenge of carrying around imposter syndrome. I used to call it a sack on my back. That's what I used to call it. Like all these things I was worried about people finding out that I knew or didn't know, but it's the same sort of idea. And again, it comes from childhood, it comes from school, it comes from all these places where a lot of white men especially are not challenged with some of that same thinking, because they've been taught to just, fake it till you make it. I don't think that always works for women and women of color. And so that's really what this is talking about. But I also think what this larger conversation is, and there was a great HBR article a few months ago about imposter syndrome that literally got 1 million views. And one of my friends, Ruchika, was the co-author of that. And it basically is, I think, what my book is also about, which is we don't give enough time to talk about how the system doesn't work and how the system is also broken. Imposter syndrome, what is happening and why it's showing up for women of color is because we've been taught from so many different angles, we are not enough. We need to behave differently in corporate structures. We need to conform more. We need to edit ourselves. And so those messages, maybe we're not taught you have imposter syndrome or be this way, but those messages come at us. And so we end up trying to cover all these things that we think we are not. That's really what it's about. And it's coming from the structure. And so one of the most important things that women can understand is it's not you. Like some of it is you, and take responsibility for the pieces that are yours and do that work. But so much of it is coming at us. And that's what we need to understand and let go of. Yeah. And so my advice is, do the work to understand what's truly yours. I call that work in the book shedding and carrying, like shed messages that don't serve you and find ways, carry forward messages that do, and do the work to replace those with messages that truly empower you and make you feel more whole. But as women of color as a group, yes, there are a lot of things that I found that are patterned, that are about us not feeling like we're enough, that we can't, prove ourselves enough, that we have to work 4 times as hard. And those all come from the system. And so for me, imposter syndrome is just really understanding it's not me. That really freed me. So the quick story and how this book came about is I was really struggling with leaving my corporate role. I had spent so much time to get to the seat. I was the first one. I felt so responsible to those coming after me. I knew it was going to be a big deal when I left. And I sat there for years, like not sure what to do, even though I had this greater sense around purpose calling at me. And so in an attempt to figure out whether to stay or go, and that's originally what the book was titled, I started meeting with women of color. By the way, I was told that was not going to be a happy book, so I couldn't write that book. But that's a different conversation.
Right.
And so I started meeting with women of color, and I ended up at one point with a partner doing 10 dinners across the country with 20 or 30 women of color each. And we would get in the room, and I was just networking for like, what's another women of color friendly company? What else what I want to do with my career? And we would get in these conversations and we would be seen by each other. We were sharing stories of microaggressions and racism, imposter syndrome. And we would be in these rooms for 6, 7, 8 hours. So 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, we were still there when dinner started at 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
And so I share that to say there's such freedom in being seen. And that was a turning point for me. Like once I knew it was not me and that I was not alone in my experience, then I felt witnessed, I felt heard, I felt like I could make change. And so that's part of what I think, in order to free ourselves from imposter syndrome, you need to know, like, I probably experience or feel 90% of what you feel just because of how we grew up in this country around imposter syndrome, not everything else. And that once we know that, we can let that go and not take that on as our problem or our deficiency. And that it's literally a reprogramming that we have to do.
So many times I've been in conversation with women colleagues and I've been like, I'm just really feeling this way. And they're like, me too. I just want to reiterate, you are never alone in your feelings. Even when it comes to work or even personally, like you're never alone in those things. And so reach out to folks, share your story, because I can guarantee you there are other people who are feeling the exact same way that you are. So I'm going to move into our first question that I got. And feel free again, raise your hand or put them in the chat. So how do you do power differently and move up the ladder when you are a woman of color being authentic, but also deal with systemic issues of fat phobia and ableism instead of just being labeled as being difficult? That's one of the first questions.
So I want to first say it's hard. So, and I said that before. And so, I mean, that has to be a lot of the theme. Like, I'm not going to be able to give you three quick answers. It's hard, but I also think it's a practice of trying and knowing. And for me, it became something where I knew where my boundaries were. So I agree with you. You can't fight every single thing. You're not going to be able to constantly stand up for every single microaggression or every boundary invasion, but knowing what you're not willing to put up with is, I think, 90% of this. And so being really clear with yourself when you're going to stand up, what you're not going to take, what you need to feel respected and feel whole, and then choosing and picking situations and deciding, in this situation, does it make sense for me to speak up or for me to present or share this part of myself? Does it make sense in this part? I've also found that the issues are slightly different, but I just want to be super clear. It happens at all levels. So some of the less tenured women I met were maybe struggling with questions around hair or, could I wear red lipstick? So that was like one set of like how I present myself. And senior women of color were struggling with like, well, I don't agree with that policy. It doesn't really serve my people. Do I want to go to the mat for that? And so it comes up at all levels. And so you just decide when and how, and it's also practice. I really come back to pushing against the system is figuring out where you sit, like how open your company is. So not all companies are created equal, or not all organizations are created equal. So understanding, and also knowing and creating a reputation for yourself. Like if you do good work, if you do lean in certain ways, there's probably more permission for you to push and ask for changes to be made. And it's also a little bit of how you do it, right? Again, not hitting people above the head with a 2x4, but sharing in ways that make sense. This is a little bit of figuring out your agency in this situation. So there's a professor that I talked to, and she, really talks about the fact that it's not helpful to tell everybody to be authentic in every situation, but it's about understanding your agency. So in important moments, you don't feel like you've compromised who you are without consciously deciding that you should. That's really what the difference is.
Yeah, no, all great advice. And made me think about so many different stories. I think about things as minor, and this is for everyone in the room, right? Things as minor as also happened during one of the orientations to the scholars. We heard a story about somebody who realized that they didn't have left-handed scissors in the office, right? And that was excluding left-handed people. And so this person was in this conversation with somebody who was left-handed, and they were like, well, why do you need left-handed scissors? Can't you just use your right hand? And they're like, pick up the scissors and put them in your left hand and try to use them. And they couldn't cut the paper, right?
Yeah.
They were like, I can't cut this paper right now. And then it clicked for them, right? And I think
I love that example. It's like the airplane example. It's like, it makes it real for people.
Yes. And then I want us to get to a point where we don't have to force people to feel the things that we feel. But until then, I think, we can emphasize that, we need things like that. Glasses are an accessibility thing, right? Like, we need things that can help us do our job more efficiently and more effectively. And we shouldn't have to be afraid to ask for those things to help make the workplace more accessible for all of us and for women of color, especially. So the next question is, can we talk about how to build a network of support within the women of color community instead of feeling like we have to compete with one another?
Yes.
Yes.
That is a big one. So, there were two really big aha moments in my research. One was how sick the women of color I met were. And so we can talk about that if we want to, but literally physically sick, like different manifestations of not being seen and heard in a structure. The second was how we don't help each other as women. So there was a lot of feedback. So I end my, I do hour-long interviews with women. And at the end of the interview, I'd say, in the last 5 minutes, is there anything I haven't asked you or anything else you want to share? First of all, it's fascinating that we're all trained this way, but the women would drop their eyes. They would get really quiet. They would almost whisper as they said it. And it was over and over again. So there's a huge amount of shame, I think, associated with it. And they would say, can we talk about how we don't help each other? For a lot of women of color, white women have been the biggest obstacle. And so we can unpack that. But even amongst women of color, right? Indian women don't always have Black women. And even within the Indian community or within the Black community, we have been taught there's one seat, right? So around a table, there's 12 seats or 12 seats on a board. And so Ella, if there's one seat open, and by the way, it's designated for women of color, which I think is nonsense, then you and I are competing for it. And what that does to us in the workplace can be conscious or unconscious, but as a result, I may not be as helpful to you. So I think that's where I talk about, that's really where doing power differently comes in. It's not just that I want to see you as an ally. And yes, at the end of the day, maybe one of us gets it, but why do we believe that there's only one seat? Why are we doing power in that sort of competitive way when there is probably a different way to think about growth and think about expansion and doesn't pin us against each other? And so that's kind of an example or an illustration of how the system makes us do that. And we have to be very conscious to not do it. And the quick answer, is also find others, find ways to be in community. So there was an example in the book of where a senior woman got to a new level, and then there were like 10 women competing for this role she felt. She took them to dinner and started having a conversation about how I don't want to do that with you. Can we do this differently? And it really changed the dialogue. So part of it is you have to be willing to put yourself out there to say, let's reframe the problem, and not everyone will do it. But you and I have had an amazing conversation about how we do that differently. You've already given me some advice just in our pre-calls on how to do some of that. So I just think we need to ask.
Yeah, we definitely do. And I will say there was a question about if we can talk about, how white women can help with this. And I will say that personally, I have benefited in my spaces when other white women have spoken up for me. And so I do ask that they continue to do that, right? And that I've also, though, experienced as a Black woman within the Black community, as you mentioned, the same aspect of like, there seems to be this competition between us. And I'm like, I'm not trying to compete. I want to see you win.
Yeah.
Right. I want to see you just up there with me. Right. Like, I want us all to win. But I think there is this, people try to play at our emotions and try to play at this aspect of like, well, you all need to compete for it. We don't need to compete for it. We just need to take over. We need to be the C-suite, the whole C-suite, right? And then we need to be the middle management. We need to take all those things, right? Like that just sort of needs to happen. And we need to bring everybody with us. Another question we got is, what are your thoughts on clothing in corporate settings? When I became a team manager, I went out and bought all these expensive dresses and button-ups and blazers and heels. I was so uncomfortable. I work and lead better in polo shirts, jeans, and tennis shoes, I think. However, I didn't want to be deemed ghetto or unprofessional. Great question.
Yeah. So the clothes and the presentation is probably the biggest question that comes up, especially when people are kind of, I would say, like early in trying to navigate and find your leadership voice. That happened for me as well. I used to get a lot of feedback that I was dressing too trendy. I think that was tied to looking young, right? Which is the Asian curse, which I disliked when I was younger, but now that I'm older, I'll take as long as I can get. But it's real. And so I will share, when I was up for partner, when you're at Deloitte and you're up for partner, you spend almost 9 months like shopping your business case around and pitching it to people. And then you do this big presentation and they kind of vote on whether you're ready or not. Yeah. And I remember getting ready for that big meeting, and like they deem it as like one of the biggest things you're going to do. And this was not like a formal feedback that I got, but from a friend of a friend who kind of pulled me aside and said, you might want to think about, I know you don't wear glasses, but do you want to go buy some glasses that don't actually magnify what you see, but just, pretend glasses or dress glasses. You might want to put your hair up. You might not want to, wear what you normally wear, because it might just be helpful. Again, my issue was appearing young, because I was young, to appear differently. And so at the end of the day, I did not do that. I did me, but I probably didn't do me as much as I would have done me had I not had that binding conversation. And so my answer is, I probably wouldn't go to a place where you're not comfortable at all. Like, if wearing a dress is not like comfortable at all, don't go there. But it may not be that sneakers work in your culture either. So maybe there's like some way where you can go 10%, but you're not going to someone you're not, because that's not going to make you comfortable, and also not going to help you lead in the ways that you need to lead in the long term. So I think it's maybe understanding what your corporate culture or your work culture will allow, and then coloring within those spaces so that it works for you. But I think you have to lean into who you are and what makes you comfortable, because otherwise it's hard to be in charge and carry that sort of power and significance as well.
And at some point, we don't have to have this conversation right now. And I think we could keep talking for hours. And so I hope that we will stay in conversation. But at some point we need to talk about gendered clothing, whether or not, right? Like that whole aspect of like what constitutes feminine, masculine clothing and leadership and all those things, right? Like that conversation sort of needs to happen at some point.
Absolutely.
But not right now. At some point though.
And I just final thing is, I think hopefully the pandemic and working from home will also change some of those things, because there were a lot of things I think we used to do. And again, as we come back to maybe being in the office more or being in public spaces more, like let's use that as a moment to, why are we doing heels? They're not comfortable. They don't really work. Like I don't want to do them anymore. Right. So it's kind of just being really conscious of that.
But also if you want to wear them, fine.
Then go for it.
And yes, how clothing looks different on different bodies, right? I acknowledge that like, personally, as a fat woman, like I have clothing that does look different on me than maybe it would look on somebody else, right? And so I'm constantly looking for those different aspects. But also I want the ability to be able to wear pants, or if I want to wear a skirt, or if I want to, like all those different things definitely come into play when we're thinking about these dynamics. We do have time for a few more questions, but before folks hop off to go on other calls or lunch or whatever it is that you need to do today, I do want to acknowledge that we had what I said at the beginning, which is that we are going to have an opportunity for all of you on this call to share your stories as well. And so much of, and this will be in the chat as well, but so much of your book was inspired by incredible stories and experiences, as we've heard. And we believe that there's just going to be a plethora of stories that are going to come out after this as well. So we're hopeful that you all will go ahead and follow the First Few Only Instagram and submit your stories on Deepa's website. So there's deepapuru.com/my-story. Follow Instagram, share your stories, and then you'll see them on the page. I mean, again, it's so important that we continue to have these conversations and to share stories. Even in the chat, you can see so many of us have had similar experiences, and we all are coming from very different backgrounds and places and all these different things. So I hope that you will continue to share your stories with Deepa, with us, and with your communities as well. I got another question. Can we discuss looking good online? You may not be perceived as professional online if you are not making the effort. Ooh.
That's a big one. I just had this conversation on a podcast last week. They're like, do you get dressed up and put on makeup and do all the stuff? And I sometimes do, I sometimes don't, but there's been new data that's come out that said, especially for women, the amount of Botox, the amount of cosmetic surgery, and the amount we're spending on makeup has really changed in the last year, because we're seeing ourselves on Zoom and more critical of what we're seeing, because we're not used to seeing ourselves for 8 or 10 hours a day. And so I think it's real. I think we also have to be much more cognizant of what that does to us, right? I sometimes catch myself doing that, right? Do I look older today? And we need to stop that. And so yes, it's hard. It's real. I think that there are, things that you can do, but it's also about what works for you and what makes you comfortable. I come from a place of what you say and how you lead is more important than what you look like. But I also am appreciative of the fact that that's not always how the world works. It's how I want the world to work. And so I start from that place, but I'm also cognizant of sometimes you get things coming at you that don't work for you.
Yes, that is so true. I was thinking about that even for this call. Yeah, like I think I put on brow and like a couple of things, right? But it is something that I think about for all of my meetings, and it doesn't change how I like interact. Like if I have it on, if I don't have it on, you're gonna get the same sort of information, right? But I do acknowledge that, yeah, we're constantly looking at ourselves, and I make a concerted effort to try and like look at the other person or like hide my self view or something like that. But it is something that's very real for all of us. And Nate put in the chat, you all are the first to see it. Look at that, exclusive. So we're definitely hopeful that you all will use the hashtag #FirstViewOnly to share your other stories. And just really continue this conversation. Again, this is something that, even within Baumhart, we're thinking about purpose, and we're thinking about women leaders and our co-conspirators that are in our cohorts, right? And thinking about how they're going to lead the future of business. And so I hope that you all will continue to share your stories with everyone around. And if we don't have any other questions, I just want to say thank you so much, Deepa, for being in conversation with me today, for being in conversation with Baumhart Center. We got one last question. And for putting out this book. I think that's really, really important. How do you assess the power in choosing to be off screen during a meeting, wanting meeting people to be virtually present? That's interesting.
Yeah, so a big theme in my book is I ended up getting really sick. And so I can't tell the whole story in a couple of minutes, but I ended up getting really sick. So I'm much more conscious of what works for me health-wise now. And that leads like, do I feel like getting ready? Do I feel like being on screen? Is it a day that doesn't work for me? And so I really try to listen to myself and where I am on the tired, exhausted time, frame. And that's kind of how I make decisions. And I've gotten much better at telling people, can we just get on a phone call? Can we do old school? Like, why do we need to be on Zoom if we don't need to? I think it's okay to ask why. I think that's part of what we're saying. Like, ask why if it doesn't make sense for you. Most people probably don't want to be on Zoom with you either.
I've definitely heard more. I've converted some Zoom calls into phone calls, walking calls, all those different things. So it is interesting how it's coming back. A lot of folks are asking if this conversation is recorded. It is recorded. We will share it with you afterwards. And of course, feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in hearing more from either Baumhart Center. Deepa, of course, is going around. There's a lot of speaking engagements, so definitely check out her page and things like that. Thank you to Aaron. Thank you to Nate for bringing us this opportunity. We really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Go out and be empowered. Have those conversations. Go talk to your coworker that maybe you're thinking like, are you feeling this way? Yeah, because I'm feeling this way. Let's talk about it. And continue to support each other. And thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'll let the, it's always like the chat is going. And so I'm really grateful for you all being in the space with us. Thanks so much. Have a good one.